Let's try to get some political answers to those questions. Has Canada's mission in Iraq changed, as Rosie was just talking about? Are we starting to see, they call mission creep, the mission that sort of creeps into something more than it was? Or was this always part of the plan, just self-defense? This is what it means. Now remember, we've got this 6-month deadline looming. What's next for Canada's fight? Joining me now from Winnipeg is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Defence, James Bezan. In St. John's, the NDP's defence critic, Jack Harris, and in Toronto, the Liberal trade critic, Chrystia Freeland. James Bezan, let me start with you. I'm going to show you a clip of Stephen Harper, the Prime Minister. This is what he promised Canadians when this mission began. Check this out.
We will also contribute 1 air-to-air refueling aircraft, 2 Aurora surveillance aircraft, and the necessary air crews and support personnel. In addition, we are extending the deployment in a non-combat role of the up to 69 members of the Canadian Army advising and assisting security forces in Iraq. There will, however, be no ground combat mission, which is explicitly ruled out in the resolution.
Given the fact that now we know that Special Forces, Canada's Special Forces, are on the front lines effectively engaging in a firefight, how is it that we're not in a combat mission on the ground then?
Well, as we've said right from the get-go, Evan, this isn't a ground combat mission. We're there in advise and assist, but we do expect that when our troops are in a situation that they're being fired upon, because you never know how ISIL is moving and if they're trying to make advances and territory is getting overrun, that our troops could fall under fire. And that's what happened this past week. And in proactive disclosure, the Canadian Armed Forces provided that information at today's technical briefing. So this is something that they had to react to. They were out there doing some reconnaissance, getting the lay of the land.
But hang on. Your version of it seems to be slightly different than what the General Rouleau said. I'm just going to read again, and we just played the clip. He said, they were effectively at the front line. As soon as they arrived, they came under very effective and direct mortar and machine gun fire. When you put our troops at the, just a second. Evan. Yeah, no, but hang on. When you put troops at the front line, obviously they're going to be shot at. That's why it's called the front line. So I guess my question is, once Canadian troops are at the front line, isn't that effectively a ground combat mission?
No, and as General Rouleau said in the briefing today, that when they sometimes have to go to the front, so if they're going to provide the proper advice and assistance to Iraqi security forces and the Kurdish Peshmerga, you have to get a lay of the land. And so they were going to the front to get that lay of the land. And he also said they were in proximity to the front line. They weren't over the front line, they weren't at the front line, they're in close proximity and came under effective fire.
Sir, he said, I'm going to quote him, they were very proximate to the front line, effective, just a second, effectively at the front lines.
Effectively.
I don't know how much more clear he can be.
And so if they're coming under attack, you know, the front line has the ability to move, as we all know it. He said it is static. It is much like a World War I scenario where the two sides are dug in, but at the same time they are trying to make advances. And so they just happen to be near the front when they're trying to make that movement. And so they are equipped to defend themselves. And they did neutralize the attack by sniper fire, and so they were able to make sure that they weren't hurt, nor the people that they were accompanying.
But remember, Mr. Bezan, during the training mission in Afghanistan, our trainers were behind what they called behind the wire, inside the camp, training then. And I remember when this mission happened, I asked you and I asked many others, does this, and we had Steve Day, the former commander of the Special Forces, JTF-2, on this program, and he said that the troops will go to the front line and effectively work alongside. I asked the military and the political people like you if that's going to happen. You said no, they will just be training. Now we find out they're actually at the front lines working with them as there's a firefight. Isn't that, I mean, it's an important, not just semantically, but politically. Does that mean our ground troops are effectively going to start coming under fire and have to fight back? That's a combat mission.
And as General Vance said today, and General Rouleau, is that this is still a low-risk mission, but no mission is without risk, as the Prime Minister said in the clip that you showed. And so we do expect that if they come under fire, that they need to defend themselves. And as I said on the show before to you, Evan, is that this is an advise and assist role. So that involves training, but it also involves reconnaissance and intelligence and command and control. And that's what I've said before on the show, and that is what our troops are providing, and they're doing it very effectively and very well. And as they said, the troops that they have trained in the Iraqi security forces are now being able to not only hold territory, but actually take some territory back. They have become much more effective, much more capable, and they are actually seeing results.
Let's get back. I want to get the opposition on this issue, because I want to get to how effective and how much progress is being made. But Jack Harris, now I want your reaction to the fact that Canadian forces have come under fire and fired back at the front lines. Is that just a moment of self-defense, or does this change, in your view, the nature of the mission?
I think this is about two things. This is about whether or not Canadians were misled, and it's about mission creep. We were worried about that at the beginning. I think now we're seeing it. You know, advise and assist were the words used at the beginning. At one point, some of the military suggested advise, assist, and accompany, and they were shut down right away by the political side, by the PMO. No, just advise, assist, not accompany. Now we're being told that 20% of the time, the special forces are at the front lines. They're there, and something that hasn't arisen in this discussion yet, but was obvious this afternoon, that they're actually also involved in calling in airstrikes. So they're at the front lines, they're calling in airstrikes to take on positions that are there. And in fact, if you look at the numbers, there's over 320 air missions, only 22 airstrikes. So as we said earlier, they were having trouble finding targets to begin with, and they've only managed to find 22 to actually strike. 16 of those were actually called in by the special forces on the ground. So we have, 20% of the time at the front line calling in for airstrikes, engaged in firefights, whether it's in who shot first doesn't really matter. You're engaged in a firefight at the front lines. That looks like combat to me. You can call it something else if you want, but if you're calling in airstrikes, you're at the front lines and you're returning fire, then I think that's what, Canadians can look at that and say, well, you can use whatever language you want, but that looks like a ground war with Canadian forces involved.
Christian Friedland, Jason McDonald says a combat role is one where our troops advance and themselves seek to engage the enemy physically, aggressively, and directly. That's not the case with this mission. But you've heard exactly what happened, that 20% of the time they are at the front lines. Now they have had this. Is it a one-off, or does this fundamentally change, in your view, the nature of the mission?
Evan, you played at the beginning the absolutely essential clip, and that was the clip of the Prime Minister saying very clearly, very explicitly, the troops were going to be there to advise and assist, and ruling out, saying this was a non-combat mission. Now, to me, the central question right now is honesty and openness with the Canadian people. This government has a dismal record on all fronts with honesty and openness with the Canadian people, and the opposition and the media right now has a really, really grave responsibility to hold the government to account.
But they said they're training. Do you not buy the fact that if they're training at the front lines and they come under fire, they've got to return fire? What's wrong with that?
Look, no one disputes the right of Canadian troops to return fire, and thank goodness they did so, and thank goodness they were successful. And I salute the professionalism of our military, and I salute their openness in talking about this. That is not the issue. But the issue is, Evan, actually exactly along your line of questioning. The point is, they were at the front line. They were exactly there. That is not what advise and assist is about. If the Prime Minister wants Canadian troops to be involved in a ground war in Iraq, he has to come clean with the Canadian people and say that that is his intention.
James Bezan, the opposition are saying this is mission creep. That the government promised one thing, and now that it's more, you're verbally justifying it, but fundamentally, Canadians were told there will not be combat on the ground. Now there is combat on the ground. Now it was one day that we found out, but if they're there at 20% of the time, let me ask you this. How often could this happen again in the future?
Look, you can't deal with hypotheticals, Evan. You know, it's absurd to think that this is mission creep. The accusations being made by the opposition just doesn't stand up. You know, this isn't a combat role. They're there, they got fired upon, they fired back. Self-defense, and I think that's all there is to it. They're there, as we said, right from the get-go. Advise and assist, command and control, reconnaissance and intelligence, and sometimes that requires that you have to go to the front. So they're there, they're scoping things out, and it was just an unfortunate situation where they found themselves in this past week. You know, unlike the Liberals who never had these debates in Parliament when they sent our troops to Afghanistan the first time, there's never ever these ongoing technical briefings. This is the third technical briefing we gave since the new year. We never saw any of that type of proactive disclosure coming from the Liberals when they were government. I mean, so we are moving forward and we're getting all this information out there. Canadians can see the great role that the Canadian Armed Forces are playing, both in the air and in the ground.
No one's justifying, no one's saying no one's not doing a great job. We're just trying to figure out what they're doing. And I think it's a fair question to ask. Are Canadian Special Forces now, I mean, if they're at the front lines 20% of the time, does the government not now realistically expect that they will be in a combat situation where they'll be fired upon and have to fire back? If they're at the front lines, would we be naive to expect that we wouldn't have this situation? And if that's the case, shouldn't Canadians know about it?
And that's why we're telling the story today of what happened, the unfortunate incident that they got fired upon, and that they had to defend themselves and use snipers to neutralize those that were attacking their position. So, you know, they're there, they have to be able to evaluate how the Iraqi security forces are making out. As they said, that they're now seeing that Iraqi soldiers are actually been able to themselves increase their sniper capabilities by over 4 times the distance, that they've been able to train medical personnel to go out there and work at the front. They've been able to have those medics out there, as well as those
training mission.
Right,
you haven't
supported anything yet, Jack. Every time we've been on this show or in the House,
we made it very clear from the beginning, Mr. Bezan, that we supported the training mission, that we thought that was fine, but we didn't trust your government to not be engaged in mission creep, and that's what we've got here now.
This isn't mission creep, Jack. You're completely misconstruing the facts that were presented.
I got a minute here, Mr. Harris, Mr. Freeland.
20% of your time at the front is a pretty high degree of engagement at the front lines in any mission, whether it be a combat mission or another mission. So I don't think that's small potatoes here. You put yourself in the front lines. You're calling in for air support and for air strikes. 16 out of 22 airstrikes came from the Special Operations Forces. You know, that's not defensive. That's aggressive. And I'm not saying it doesn't help. And I agree with Christina. You know, this training people that was being done was very professional, and I think they gave good examples of that today, how effective that has been. But if you're saying you're doing just advising and assistance, then I think we've gone beyond that, and that's not what the Canadian people were told about.
Christopher Freeland, so what do you think? Does it have to go to another vote now? What's the consequence of this in your view?
The consequence is that the Prime Minister is showing yet again his disregard for being open with the Canadian people. If he wants a ground war, if he wants Canada involved in a ground war in Iraq, he has to say so. He said very, very clearly, as you showed, this was about advising and assisting. It was not a combat role. We're now hearing, as Jack said, 20% of the time. So, you know, the Prime Minister has to come clean. He has to be open. This is the big flaw. This is the characteristic of this government.
All right, I got to leave it there. James Bezan, Jack Harris, Christopher Freeland. Obviously, lots more on this. I appreciate your time as always. A very important discussion.